You can have a great network and have a book that people don't love, and they either give it bad reviews or they politely just don't cover it. No one knows what's going to end up selling unless you're a superstar with a tell-all memoir. It's pretty hard to know. And so this book got a lot of publicity, but it wasn't hinging on one big thing, like I was going to be on The View or book club pick for someone or anything like that. And you can be on those things and still not have a bestseller. So it's a very strange industry.
My name is Bethany Saltman, and I am an author and a best-selling book coach.
And I'm Fran Hauser. I'm an author, a keynote speaker, and a publishing strategist. These How I Did It conversations will inspire listeners to claim their own authority mindset and turn the story they can't stop telling into a book the world needs to read.
This is Bookbound, the podcast, created in partnership with Share Your Genius.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Bookbound. I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest, Marisa Meltzer. She's the author of New York Times bestseller, Glossy, Ambition, Beauty, and the Inside Story of Emily Weiss's Glossier. Marisa has written for Vogue, Vanity Fair, and the New York Times, just to name a few. She's a veteran writer who gave Bethany and me so much insight into the writing process. She explains how she discovered the story she couldn't stop telling, and how that led her to this book. It was an obsession, something she was deeply passionate about, and in an industry she was entrenched in. Her authority and the story she couldn't stop thinking about turned into a bestseller. This is what we love to hear. So, I won't hold you up any longer. Let's dive into this insightful conversation with Marisa. You're going to love it.
Hey, we are so excited to be here with Marisa Meltzer, the author of Glossy, which I'm so excited. I finally got an excuse, a chance, an opportunity to completely read. I've been really wanting to read it for a long time. So I'm going to give it to my daughter next. She's waiting. It's really exciting to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
My absolute pleasure.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with the way we begin all of these conversations about the story you can't stop telling. How did you know that this was a book and not an article or an essay? And in your book, you actually begin and end with the process of discovering that this was, in fact, a book. Since you are a career author and you have several books, I'd love it if you could tell our listeners who are often at the beginning of their writing career how you do that work of finding the story. There's so many factors involved, but you talk about it really beautifully in the book. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
In some ways, it was cheating with this book because it was originally an article, sort of. As a journalist, I had written about Glossier and its founder, Emily Weiss, numerous times from the start of the company, just as a source in a story. And I had written profiles of the company for Wired magazine and for Vanity Fair. And the Vanity Fair one was one of the last things that I had really worked on before lockdown for pandemic. So I was home alone looking at myself in the mirror, thinking about beauty and not fashion kind of for the first time. Glossier was very fresh on my mind. And the article I'd written for Vanity Fair was long by magazine standards, several thousand words, but I felt like I had still so much to say. And Glossier was really at the center of all of these kind of themes that I was obsessed with at the time, like venture capital and direct-to-consumer companies and the girl bosses and the rise of the beauty industry and how the very aesthetic values of what we were considering beautiful as a sort of culture and how those were changing. I thought there really wasn't any book like that out there. There weren't that many books even about the beauty industry. There aren't even that many about fashion in some ways. There really weren't any about beauty. And so I started to explore it as like a book proposal. That was, I would say, a good 6 to 9 months or something like that.
Of writing the proposal, 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, writing a draft and then getting comments from my agent and writing a completely different draft. It just had a lot of different ways of telling the story and the order. And then it didn't even really become about Glossier until even after I sold the book. So, even then, like, you really have to kind of be open, or at least I try to be open to things shifting, which is hard for me. I like to outline things. I like to know how things begin and end before I start writing. And that just didn't end up being the case with this project because there just kept being breaking news parts of it. Like someone would decide to give you an interview at the very last minute, or the one whole draft when Emily, the founder and CEO, stepped down as CEO. And it was like, oh, this makes the book feel different. So I had to be really open to a certain amount of change or fluidity or, all of that, which is not always my strong point. But yeah, for this was a project where the sort of initial obsessions and themes were there from the beginning, but the way that it was going to be told changed so many times. And ultimately, I think what came out was way better than any of my initial ideas, like using Glossier as a focus and really having a story to tell really benefited for the book. I think especially books that are more about like ideas, and often books that are written by journalists sometimes lack that real gripping story that makes you not want to put it down. And so often it's, I'm following this character and this character, and here I am in this chapter doing this thing, and here I am in another. And it feels like a bunch of articles strung together or something like that. And that's challenging. And so this was really a way to write a book that was one cohesive story with a lot of subplots and themes and other things. And I think that really helped, because the thing that I most hear from people is that they couldn't put it down, that it was a fast read and thrilling. And I love hearing that. And that was also very much by design. And so, yeah.
So Marissa, I have to tell you, the other professional hat that I've been wearing for the last 12 years now is that I've been a startup investor. So I've invested in a lot of female founded companies.
Are any of them in the book?
I'm an informal advisor to Run the Runway. But this book, it was just so interesting for me because when Into the Gloss started, I was at InStyle. I was working at Time Inc. And I remember the importance of that blog. Like I remember us looking at it even as a potential acquisition target. We had like our list, right? Our list of potential targets. And so I just remember watching it very closely. And then it was really interesting when it turned into Glossier. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I ended up buying the book for all of the female founders in my portfolio. I felt like there was so much that they could take away and learn.
Yeah. Did you buy it for them as like a cautionary tale, or as because it can be read in so many different ways?
It can be read in so many different ways. But I think for me too, what I also really loved about it is that it wasn't your typical girl boss takedown story, which is really what was prevalent in the press, especially at the time that you were working on this. And even when it came out, it was just a really interesting story about how this woman, started this blog that ended up turning into this huge business. I loved it. And I shared it with so many people in my network. So thank you so much for writing it. I'm really curious to hear your first book, I believe, was published in 2007, if I have that right. So 15 years, 16 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about getting this book published, getting Glossy published versus getting that book published? Like, what was the process like? I mean, I think that was even before social media really took off, 2007. So I'm just thinking about like the author platform, the book proposal.
And how has the business changed just in general?
Yeah. There are a lot of differences also because my first book was about Sassy Magazine, which was this like cult teen magazine. And so it was also just a different scale of a book. It wasn't something where it was like some blockbuster deal, but there was different kind of pressure. And also at the time, part of kind of the message of that book was that a lot of the original writers and editors and people who made Sassy were still in the media business and had gone to great acclaim. And so they were still around and they were at all of these magazines that no longer exist. I remember going to like the Fairchild building and Time Inc. and all of those places and all those shopping magazines that no longer exist. So I think that book was sold a little more on access or the idea of access rather than me having a specific platform. Also, platform then was much harder to quantify. It feels like everything is a little bit of data and a popularity contest, but yeah, it was different, but then in some ways it's the same. You're still writing the same kind of format of book proposal and looking at other books as competition. The marketing and publicity is different because you want to be on Book Talk and you want to be on podcasts, but there's still this idea of being on like a morning show or TV is like the holy grail. Or, having a big book review in the New York Times or be on the cover of a Sunday book review or whatever. And those things are the same as they always were. And I don't know if that's because so relatively few people read or that the age of people who read is older or not. Although the success of my book, of Glossy, makes me think there are plenty of people who are younger who are buying the book and reading it, or the success of like Jeanette McCurdy or Julia Fox's books or something like that.
Well, and this book is going to become a TV show. You're in the process.
Yeah. I mean, if all goes as planned, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that. How's that feeling? And how do you think that happened? What is it about this story that makes it so recognizable?
Well, I think that you can kind of see what the world of Glossier on a set would be. I mean, obviously the stores exist, but you could see what you could kind of do in a movie or TV space with an office and these characters. So yeah, I think that was part of it, the sort of visual aspect. The role of Emily and plenty of other people are like great meaty roles for women. And then the book got a lot of publicity. And so you get a lot of people sort of sticking their nose in your office and wanting to check in and wanting to see what's going on and all of that. So there was a lot of interest, but I don't have, at least yet, a great desire to become a screenwriter. I already knew what my next book was going to be. So I'm not really involved in it or writing the adaptation. And honestly, I think that's probably a good thing. I often think that books that have been adapted by their own writers are often too faithful to the story and too pious or something like that. I want someone who has a vision and a world and something they really want to tell.
I want to go back to the publicity, because the publicity for this book was incredible. And I'd love to hear, was that all your publisher? Was it their publicist? Did you have your own publicist also working on this?
I didn't know. I mean, it's really a group effort. I did not hire an outside publicist, mostly because I just can't afford it. And also, they charge a lot. And I kind of think that someone like me who already is a journalist and has a lot of relationships, like if anyone doesn't need it, it should be me. Like I should be able to figure that stuff out more on my own. So it was really a team effort between my publicist, Fallon Kirby, and me, and Jen Marshall, my agent, who used to be a publicist at Viking before she was a literary agent. But yeah, I mean, it was calling in every favor. I went on a ton of coffee and lunch dates. I interviewed Gwyneth Paltrow and like brought her a book just in case she would read it or do anything with it. I don't know that she has, but I just lost all humility and was just sort of bringing the book to people and asking them to read it. And you could also write an amazing book and not have any of that stuff work out too. So it's kind of, I got lucky at the same time.
Well, lucky. And you have been working for many years to create that network.
For sure. And also, you can have a great network and have a book that people don't love, and they either give it bad reviews or they politely just don't cover it. No one knows what's going to end up selling unless you're a superstar with a tell all memoir. It's pretty hard to know. And so this book got a lot of publicity, but it wasn't hinging on one big thing. Like I was going to be on The View or book club pick for someone or anything like that. And frankly, you can be on those things and still not have a bestseller. So it's a very strange industry. And
One of the things that I talk to the writers that I work with about a lot, which is surprising to them, they haven't thought about it before, is the idea of stakes. The story has to have stakes. If you're a journalist, less so, but a lot of people I work with are experts in their field, giving the details of the interesting things about what they know or what the field has to say. I'm interested to hear your take on the stakes, because obviously this book has really solid stakes. Otherwise, it wouldn't be picked up for a show, because that's at the heart of any kind of a narrative in a show. So can you tell us a little bit about what do you think the stakes are in this book, in this story?
I tend to think a little more along what do I want? Like, who is the villain or like, what are we working against? I guess for me, it's less about whether or not Emily Weiss is a good person or a bad person. And it's more about the sort of environment around Glossier, like the ways in which taking venture capital money in a huge amount and how accelerating the growth of your company and all of these things that give you less and less control can be, I don't know, really challenging. And the way that your sort of persona can be used in the world in the case of kind of like the girl boss moment and this idea of ambition, of not being happy, or at least not settling for just a cult blog that in an alternate universe could have been acquired by Time Inc. or Hearst or Condé Nast, what have you, and become a media mogul, but instead decided to make their own beauty products. And I guess for me, it's all of these exterior factors that contribute directly to something that in a way is like small and personal, which is just this company that you start.
I'm curious, has she read the book?
I don't know. And I'm not being coy. I really don't. I put in a formal request or question in with her and her communications team. It was kind of terrifying to do because, to put yourself up. Yeah, also just so that I could try to officially have an answer when people ask me, and never heard back. Glossier did a Women's Wear Daily story where the writer asked Emily about it. And she gave a very, if you read the book, she has a certain way, sort of roundabout way of saying things without saying a lot. And she gave a very similar answer of, yeah, it's a book. There are other companies that have existed longer that don't have a book. I would love to know what she thinks, but also the book is for everyone. The book is not for Glossier or for its employees, although I'm sure some of them are having a great time with it. It's for, people that are fans and people that are interested in all the topics around it. And that was really who I was writing for and who the audience was.
Yeah. What was the process actually like in terms of pitching the book to publishers? Was it an easy sell?
Yes and no. I mean, there was definitely interest. I think because the book initially was sort of more broadly about the beauty industry, with Glossier as kind of a central through line, but less the story of Glossier and more maybe the story of an era, that every editor kind of has a different take on it. I mean, some are like, I want it exactly as you're telling it, and others want to change it completely. There were some parts that I thought were a little bit revelatory. Like there was one male editor who was interested, but also that kind of core idea that men have a really hard time engaging with culture that is not squarely for and about them because they're so used to everything being about them, that anything that's out of their wheelhouse, I think they get a little intimidated by, frankly, because they're just not used to it. And I say that with love because he seems like a really lovely and curious person. But I've actually found that with every book I've ever sold, is that every editor kind of see eye to eye with you, and some have very different takes, and sometimes their ideas are amazing And sometimes they're wacky, and sometimes it's, no, I don't want to turn this into like a coffee table book. It's always kind of all over the place, I find.
So, since you've written so many books, I'm curious about how you work with yourself. So, I imagine that the external process gets easier. You're a known quantity, you've got contacts, connections, network. But internally, I know for myself and for people that I work with, I can do well in one project and then somehow my authority, I don't bring it with me to the next one. So I'm curious about how you work with yourself going from book to book. If you feel like, oh, I've got this, I've done this before, I can do it again. How is that for you?
In some ways, the process is similar and it repeats itself, where it's like, okay, now I'm outlining things, I'm interviewing people, I'm gathering archival work, but also I freak out every book in different ways. But there's always a huge amount of anxiety that feels very real and, probably is, or at least good to think about, that like it won't come together or I won't get the interviews. That part is really terrifying. Doing anything a few times, you're able to see like it feels real and unique each time.
Yeah. So what's the next book?
It's about Jane Birkin. It's a biography, but also kind of the way that Glossy has this kind of background of culture and girl bosses and all of that. Jane Birkin will have a lot of information about the selling of the myth of the French girl and the marketing of that to the world. So I think it should be really interesting. So I'm in Paris right now doing archival research and interviewing people and all of that good stuff.
Oh, Marisa, we're so jealous.
I can't wait for you to all read it.
Yeah, when?
I haven't written even a first draft yet, but it's slated to come out in probably summer 2025.
Oh,
do you have a title for it yet?
Moi non plus.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for this book. I think this is like the perfect spot to wrap this up. Marisa, you were so generous with us. Thank you for sharing your experiences, your wisdom, your time, and let our listeners know what's the best way to connect with you, to follow you. Where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram at Marisa Meltzer, just my first and last name is one word. And there's marisameltzer.com, a website that has a lot of my work and contact information and all of that. So I'm easy.
Amazing. Enjoy France.
Thank you.
thanks for coming. Thank you for joining us on Bookbound.
If you like what you heard, please subscribe and rate and review us on your favorite podcast listening platform.
Please visit us at bookboundpodcast.com for more on us and how we work with authors.